Hi, everyone. This is Paul Pereira, Vice President of Patient Advocacy at Saniona. And I'd like to welcome you to Saniona's Community Voices, where we highlight the voices of people living with rare diseases, their caregivers, and their medical professionals. Today, we're here to talk about Prader-Willi syndrome with Dr. Anthony Holland. Dr. Holland is Professor Emeritus at the University of Cambridge and a psychiatrist with decades of experience in PWS. Dr. Holland also serves on Saniona's Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Holland, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Holland, what is Prader-Willi syndrome? What are its signs and symptoms?
Well, Prader-Willi syndrome is a genetic syndrome that is apparent at birth because the baby born with Prader-Willi syndrome is very floppy. It's referred to as hypertonia. And also that baby often doesn't thrive in early childhood and needs a lot of additional support, may, for example, need tube feeding and so on. And so that's one of the key features. Also, as they get older, then you see some of the other features appearing. So, for example, a child as they get older, they will have some developmental delay. They will also have evidence of low sex hormones and low growth hormone. But one of the really striking features of people with Prader-Willi syndrome is that at some point in early childhood, they shift from this early stage of not being able to feed and not thriving properly and needing a lot of support to developing what's often referred to as an insatiable appetite. So if the diagnosis hasn't been made, if parents aren't aware of this issue, then what happens is that they continue to give their child food. And before they realize it, their child has become very obese because the child now is taking in too much food rather than having to be encouraged to eat food. And this is one of the key hallmarks of people with Prader-Willi syndrome, is this excessive desire to eat, or what's referred to as hyperphagia.
Doctor, what is hyperphagia and how does it affect people with Prader-Willi syndrome?
So hyperphagia really refers to excessive eating. So normally for you and I, our body is very good at controlling how much we should eat. So the body has to sort of match how much energy we need in the form of food against how much energy we use in terms of to keep our body alive, the exercise we take, and so on. But for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, it seems as if that is abnormal, and therefore they continue to eat even though they don't need that number of calories. And therefore, they obviously get very severely obese if you don't manage that tendency to hyperphagia. And it's a very characteristic feature of people with Prader-Willi syndrome. It may vary a bit in intensity, but usually leads to the need for quite strict controls around access to food. Otherwise, severe obesity develops.
What impact do you think hyperphagia has on caregivers and families?
Right. I think hyperphagia really is one of two major issues that impacts mostly on the lives of someone with Prader-Willi syndrome and that of their families. And I think the reason for that is really twofold. Firstly, as I described earlier, hyperphagia can be so severe that it can lead to very severe and life-threatening obesity. So it has an immediate impact upon the quality of life and the life expectancy of the person with Prader-Willi syndrome. But the second way I think it impacts on people's lives, and particularly of the family, is that we don't have any specific treatments for that at the moment. So one really has to advise families to prevent severe obesity developing by controlling access to food. And at its most marked, that might be locking the food cupboards, locking the kitchen, locking the fridge, and so on. Now that has an immediate impact on the rest of the family. It's very tough on siblings, for example, who would be used to going to help themselves to a snack or whatever. So it really changes the dynamic of family life. And this may be very critical, particularly in some cultures where meal times and food is really very central to family life.
What are the psychosocial aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome?
I think the psychosocial aspects of Prader-Willi syndrome really are partly related to the sort of disability that's associated with having Prader-Willi syndrome. And by that, I mean the mild learning disabilities, as well as the problems related to eating and the tendency to temper outbursts. So that impacts, I think, on the life of the person with Prader-Willi syndrome and their families. But the way I think that impacts will, of course, change over time. So for people with Prader-Willi syndrome, independence, making choices, and those sorts of things in their life becomes quite problematic, because if they're in an environment, say as a teenager, where there's access to food and so on, the temptation to eat may be quite considerable. So families will tend to want to be perhaps overprotective, or at least to be control access to food and manage access to food. So it really does, it's really impact upon someone's ability to lead a more independent life. In many ways, they have the skills to do that with some support. It is the hyperphagia and this risk of obesity that is such a major issue, along with some other problems. So a tendency for people with Prader-Willi syndrome to have some social impairments, a bit like people with autism, to be perhaps rather naive in social settings and so on. But I think they're the various ways that having Prader-Willi syndrome impacts on the more psychosocial environment, and particularly as they get older towards adult life.
Doctor, what are some of the common myths about Prader-Willi syndrome?
It would be, I think, that if only they tried harder, they could control their eating behavior. And I think that is a serious misunderstanding. The evidence is really quite clear that the systems within the brain and within the body that control the way we limit food and we control our food intake are really abnormal. It isn't a choice for people with Prader-Willi syndrome. They really lack the ability to effectively manage their eating behavior in the context of food.
Doctor, what advice do you provide for parents after their child is diagnosed with PWS?
I mean, the first advice is to help families understand the nature of their child's disability, the reasons for it, that it's not their fault that their child has been born with this genetic abnormality. And then I think it's really about trying to focus down on some of the key issues that are rather more specific to having Prader-Willi syndrome. And so the first issue, of course, is to help the family through this floppy phase. You need to help them through that phase in terms of how to feed the child. But as the child develops, of course, the next bit of advice is really about this switch from undereating to overeating. So usually one's encouraging people to keep an eye on weight, as well as to observe the eating behavior of their son or daughter. There's a question about when to start growth hormone. By giving growth hormone, you ensure the normal growth of the child. You also improve muscle mass. And there are some other benefits, including cognitive benefits, to having growth hormone. So there's a decision to be made by the parents whether or not they wish their child, their son or daughter, to have growth hormone. I think as you get older, then of course you move into areas of schooling and education, but also you may move into areas of behavior problems and mental health problems and so on. So one really picks up those particular issues as and when they arise.
Doctor, what innovations do you hope to see for people with PWS?
I think actually this is a very exciting time for Prader-Willi syndrome. Largely because I think we are seeing new treatments being tried and developed. And also we have the ability to much better understand some of the fundamental problems, for example, in the brain, as well as the genetics of Prader-Willi syndrome. So we're seeing trials for agents to treat the overeating, the hyperphagia, and if we could treat the hyperphagia, that would make a very big difference in people's lives. We're also seeing trials of interventions to better manage some of the other behavior problems. So we're seeing the development of services, support services for people with Prader-Willi syndrome that are specific to people with Prader-Willi syndrome, so that the food again can be managed and severe obesity can be prevented.
Excellent. Thank you, Doctor. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Paul.